Chapter 1. The Reading of the Will. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine morning in May, secateurs in hand as she carefully pruned her beloved roses. The gentle warmth of spring had coaxed her prized blooms into a spectacular display this year, and she hummed softly to herself as she worked. The tranquillity of her garden, however, was soon to be interrupted. The sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path caused Miss Marple to look up, just in time to see her dear friend Dolly Bantry bustling toward her, an expression of barely contained excitement on her face. "Jane! Oh, Jane, you'll never believe what's happened," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, slightly out of breath. "The most extraordinary thing. It's all over the village." Miss Marple smiled fondly at her friend. Mrs. Bantry had always possessed a certain enthusiasm for village news that Miss Marple found rather endearing, if occasionally exhausting. "Good morning, Dolly. Do sit down and catch your breath," she said, indicating the garden chair beside her. "Whatever is the matter?" "It's about Richard Blackwood's will," Mrs. Bantry said, settling herself down. "You know he passed away last week. Heart failure, poor man. Well, they've just had the reading of the will, and my dear, such a scene. I had it from Mrs. Petherick, who had it directly from her husband." "Mr. Petherick was the family solicitor, I believe?" Miss Marple asked, carefully placing her secateurs down and giving her friend her full attention. "Yes, precisely. And thank goodness he was there to maintain some semblance of dignity, because according to him, the Blackwood children were absolutely beside themselves." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The Blackwoods were not, strictly speaking, her neighbours, as Blackwood Manor lay on the other side of St. Mary Mead. But in a village of this size, everyone knew everyone else's business to some degree. "I understood that Richard Blackwood was quite wealthy," she remarked. "Something to do with manufacturing, wasn't it?" "Industrial components," Mrs. Bantry confirmed. "Made a fortune during the war and never looked back. And that's precisely what has caused all the fuss. He's left practically everything to that young wife of his, Elaine." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple. "The former secretary, I believe. They married rather quickly, as I recall." 18 months ago," Mrs. Bantry said with a significant nod. "And she couldn't have been more than 35 to his 68. You can imagine what people said at the time." Miss Marple could indeed imagine, having lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know exactly how village gossip operated. A wealthy widower marrying his much younger secretary would have provided weeks of conversation fodder. "And now he's left her everything?" she inquired. "Everything of consequence," Mrs. Bantry confirmed with evident relish. "The house, his controlling interest in the company, investments, art collection, the lot. The 3 children have been left with what Mr. Petherick described as modest annuities, quite insufficient for the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed, I'm sure." "And the children are—" Miss Marple prompted, trying to recall the Blackwood offspring whom she had seen only occasionally at church or village functions. "James is the eldest, mid-40s, very serious, works in the family business. Then there's Margaret, dreadfully sharp-tongued woman, never married. And Robert, the youngest, bit of a charmer, but rather aimless from what I gather. None of them ever seemed particularly fond of their stepmother. And now—" Mrs. Bantry trailed off meaningfully. "I imagine they're quite upset," Miss Marple said mildly. "Upset!" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. James Blackwood apparently accused Elaine of manipulation and undue influence right there in Mr. Petherick's office. Margaret called her a gold-digging harlot. Those were her exact words, according to Mrs. Petherick. And poor Robert had to physically restrain her from advancing on the widow. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. How very unpleasant for Mrs. Blackwood. That's not even the half of it, Mrs. Bantry continued eagerly. The real shock is that apparently Richard had only changed his will quite recently, just a month before his death. Previously, the estate had been divided more equitably among his children, with adequate provision for Elaine, of course. I see, Miss Marple murmured. That is rather significant. Significant enough that James is already talking about contesting the will, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. I suspect we haven't heard the last of this particular drama. Miss Marple was about to respond when she noticed another figure approaching her garden gate, a slender woman dressed in elegant morning clothes. I do believe that's Mrs. Blackwood herself, she remarked, causing Mrs. Bantry to turn around in her seat with barely disguised curiosity. Elaine Blackwood hesitated at the gate, then, seeing that Miss Marple had noticed her, pushed it open and came up the garden path. She was an attractive woman with dark hair pulled back in a chignon, her complexion somewhat pale, perhaps from recent stress. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quiet but composed. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied kindly. "You know Mrs. Bantry, I believe?" "Yes, of course. Good morning, Mrs. Bantry." Mrs. Bantry, suddenly conscious of having been discussing the newcomer only moments before, flushed slightly. "Mrs. Blackwood, please accept my condolences on your loss." "Thank you," Elaine said, with a small nod. She turned back to Miss Marple. "I was wondering if I might speak with you, Miss Marple. In private, if possible. Colonel Melchett once mentioned that you have a certain wisdom about human nature. I find myself in need of such wisdom." Mrs. Bantry, recognizing a dismissal when she heard one, rose to her feet. "I should be getting back. Arthur will be wondering where I've got to. Jane, I'll call on you tomorrow, shall I? Mrs. Blackwood, again, my sympathies." After Mrs. Bantry had departed, Miss Marple invited Elaine to sit and offered her some tea, which the younger woman accepted gratefully. "It's been a difficult morning," Elaine said, once they were settled with steaming cups. "I'm sure Mrs. Bantry was telling you about the reading of the will." "She did mention there had been some unpleasantness," Miss Marple acknowledged. Elaine gave a small, bitter laugh. "That's putting it mildly. Richard's children hate me, Miss Marple. They've always resented me, but now they seem to positively despise me." "I'm very sorry to hear that," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be terribly difficult, dealing with such animosity while grieving." "The truth is," Elaine continued, her fingers tightening around her teacup, "I didn't know Richard had changed his will so substantially. I tried to tell them that, but they wouldn't believe me. James called me a manipulative schemer to my face." Miss Marple observed her guest carefully. Despite her obvious distress, there was something oddly composed about Elaine Blackwood's demeanor, a certain steadiness that seemed at odds with her situation. "And have you any idea why your husband might have made such a significant change?" Elaine sighed. Richard had been concerned about his children's financial judgment. James has made some questionable decisions at the company. Margaret spends excessively. And Robert. She paused. "Robert has gambling issues that Richard was very worried about, but I never imagined he would disinherit them to this extent." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "And what is it that you think I might help you with, Mrs. Blackwood?" Elaine reached into her handbag and withdrew an envelope. "I've been receiving these. This is the third one." Miss Marple took the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. On it, in letters cut from what appeared to be magazines, was a simple message: "He's gone. You're next." Have you shown these to the police? Miss Marple asked, her voice sharp. Not yet, Elaine admitted. I wasn't sure. I thought perhaps it was just anger, that it would pass. But after today's scene, I'm not so certain. I think you should inform Inspector Slack immediately, Miss Marple advised. These are serious threats, Mrs. Blackwood. Yes, perhaps you're right, Elaine agreed, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. There's something else, though. Something I haven't told anyone. The night before Richard died, I overheard him arguing with someone. I couldn't make out who it was, but he sounded quite distressed. The next morning, he was dead. Miss Marple considered this information carefully. Did you mention this to Dr. Haydock? No. Elaine shook her head. Richard had been ill for some time. His heart was weak. Dr. Haydock said the death was entirely expected, if perhaps a bit sudden. A slight frown crossed Miss Marple's face. Nevertheless, given these threats, perhaps it would be prudent to ensure there were no irregularities. Before Elaine could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a tall, distinguished elderly gentleman, who Miss Marple immediately recognized as Mr. Petherick, the Blackwood family solicitor, and her own legal adviser. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat. I was hoping to find you at home. And Mrs. Blackwood, good day to you. Elaine rose to her feet. I should be going anyway. Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple, and for listening. I'll consider your advice about the police. After Elaine had departed, Mr. Petherick took the vacated seat, his expression grave. I apologize for interrupting your conversation, he said, but I have a matter of some importance to discuss with you. Concerning the Blackwoods, I presume? Miss Marple inquired. Indeed. Richard Blackwood came to see me about 2 months ago, shortly after changing his will. He made a rather unusual request. He said that if anything unusual occurred after his death, I was to consult with you. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose in surprise. With me? But I barely knew the man. Nevertheless, he specifically mentioned you by name. He said you had a unique perspective on human nature that might prove valuable. Mr. Petherick paused. Given the circumstances of the will reading today, and certain other factors, I felt it was time to honor his request. What other factors? Miss Marple asked. Richard died of heart failure, as expected, given his condition. But the timing, just weeks after changing his will so dramatically, has raised questions. And this morning, I received a call from Elaine. Apparently, someone broke into Blackwood Manor last night and ransacked Richard's study. Was anything taken? That's the curious thing, Mr. Petherick said. According to Elaine, nothing appears to be missing. It's as if someone was searching for something specific, but didn't find it. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her eyes suddenly sharp and focused. Mr. Petherick, I think you'd better tell me everything you know about the Blackwood family and this new will. As the solicitor began to speak, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully toward the garden gate, where Elaine Blackwood had disappeared. Despite the woman's apparent distress, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel that she hadn't been told the whole truth. And in her experience, where there were secrets, there was often danger. Chapter 2. Letters from Beyond. The following morning, Miss Marple presented herself at Blackwood Manor under the pretext of helping Elaine catalogue the late Richard Blackwood's extensive library. The grand house, set back from the main road behind wrought iron gates, had always struck Miss Marple as somewhat ostentatious for St. Mary Mead, a testament to Richard Blackwood's wealth rather than taste. How kind of you to come, Miss Marple, Elaine said, leading her through the imposing entrance hall. The library is rather overwhelming, and I confess I've been putting off the task. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. I understand entirely, my dear. Facing a deceased loved one's possessions can be quite difficult. My late sister-in-law had the most extraordinary collection of first editions. It took me weeks to properly catalogue them after her passing. As they crossed the hall, Miss Marple caught sight of a tall, austere-looking man descending the main staircase. His face, with its sharp features and cold grey eyes, bore an unmistakable resemblance to a portrait of Richard Blackwood hanging above the fireplace, though lacking the warmer expression captured by the artist. "Ah, James," Elaine said, her voice noticeably cooling. "This is Miss Marple from the village. She's kindly offered to help me catalogue your father's library." James Blackwood gave Miss Marple a cursory glance that bordered on dismissive. "My father's library will be dealt with when the will is contested," he said. "There's no need to inconvenience the locals." "Nevertheless," Elaine replied, with a controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes, "as the current legal owner of both house and contents, I've accepted Miss Marple's assistance." A muscle twitched in James's jaw, but he merely inclined his head stiffly and continued toward what Miss Marple presumed was the study. After he'd gone, Elaine exhaled softly. "You must forgive James," she said. "He's finding the situation difficult." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple murmured, though her sharp eyes had missed nothing of the exchange. The library proved to be a magnificent room spanning the eastern wing of the house, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable leather armchairs positioned near tall windows. A woman sat in one of these chairs, a book open on her lap, though her attention was clearly elsewhere. She looked up sharply as they entered. "Margaret, you remember Miss Marple from the village?" Elaine said. The woman, thin, with angular features that might have been attractive were they not set in an expression of perpetual discontent, closed her book with a snap. "Of course, the amateur detective who involves herself in everyone's business." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, undisturbed by the acerbic greeting. "How do you do, Miss Blackwood? I'm merely here to help with the library." "Father's library was meant to come to me," Margaret said, rising from her chair. "I was the only one who shared his love of literature. But then he made many inexplicable decisions toward the end." Her pointed gaze at Elaine left no doubt as to what decision she considered most inexplicable. "Margaret," Elaine began, but the other woman was already striding from the room, back rigid with disapproval. "Well," said Miss Marple after a moment, "shall we begin with the catalogue?" They worked steadily throughout the morning, with Miss Marple making meticulous notes while Elaine explained the general organization system. Around noon, a younger man appeared in the doorway, handsome in a careless way, with the same Blackwood features as his siblings, but softened, his manner more relaxed. "Elaine, Hopkins wants to know about lunch arrangements," he said, then noticed Miss Marple. "Oh, hello. I'm Robert Blackwood." "Miss Marple is helping me with the library, Robert," Elaine explained. "Miss Marple, would you care to join us for lunch?" "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose on family time." Miss Marple demurred. Robert gave a short, humorless laugh. "Family time at Blackwood Manor isn't exactly Norman Rockwell these days. Please stay. It might make everyone behave for once." Despite her protests, Miss Marple found herself at the Blackwood dining table an hour later, observing the family dynamics with keen interest. James ate in stone-walled silence, occasionally checking his wristwatch impatiently. Margaret pushed food around her plate, making cutting remarks about the inadequacy of the new cook Elaine had hired. Robert, seemingly the most amiable of the siblings, made valiant attempts at conversation, though Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to a crystal decanter of whiskey on the sideboard with increasing frequency. After lunch, Miss Marple requested to see Richard's desk, explaining that understanding his personal cataloguing system might help with the library project. Elaine led her to the study, the same room James had headed to earlier, which showed clear signs of the break-in Mr. Petherick had mentioned. Drawers had been pulled out, papers scattered, and books removed from shelves. "The police came yesterday," Elaine explained, "Inspector Slack, but they couldn't find any signs of forced entry, and as I said, nothing seems to be missing." Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly over the polished mahogany of Richard's desk. "Such an elegant piece. Victorian, isn't it? My father had a similar one with the most ingenious hidden compartments." Elaine looked surprised. "Hidden compartments?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said enthusiastically. "Furniture makers of that period were very clever. There was often a secret drawer released by pressing a particular ornamental carving, or sometimes a false bottom in one of the regular drawers." She demonstrated on the desk, her fingers moving expertly across the woodwork until there was a barely audible click. A small panel slid open beneath one of the drawers, revealing a hidden compartment containing several sealed envelopes. Elaine gasped. "I had no idea. Richard never mentioned anything about hidden compartments or letters." Miss Marple carefully withdrew the envelopes. Each was addressed in Richard Blackwood's distinctive handwriting to a different recipient. Mr. Petherick, Elaine, James, Margaret, Robert, and to Miss Marple's considerable surprise, one to herself. Across each envelope was written the same instruction: "To be opened in the event of my death under suspicious circumstances." But Richard's death wasn't suspicious, Elaine said, her voice uncertain. It was his heart. Dr. Haydock confirmed it. "Nevertheless, he seems to have prepared for every eventuality," Miss Marple observed, studying the envelopes. "I believe we should contact Mr. Petherick immediately." Mr. Petherick arrived within the hour, his usually composed face showing signs of agitation when presented with the letters. "Most irregular," he muttered. "Most irregular indeed." "Should we open them?" Elaine asked. The solicitor hesitated. "Strictly speaking, Richard's death has not been declared suspicious. However, given the break-in and the threats you've received, Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps prudence dictates we should examine at least the one addressed to me." With careful precision, Mr. Petherick slit open his envelope and extracted a single sheet of paper covered in Richard Blackwood's handwriting. As he read, his bushy eyebrows drew together in a deep frown. "My dear Petherick," he read aloud, "if you are reading this, then circumstances following my death have given cause for concern. I have reason to believe that someone might attempt to hasten my demise, though I cannot say for certain who or why. More troubling still is my growing suspicion that my first wife's death 15 years ago, officially ruled an accident, might in fact have been murder. I have entrusted certain information to various individuals, none of whom possess the complete picture. Only by bringing these pieces together can the whole truth be revealed. I trust you to handle this matter with your customary discretion. Yours sincerely, Richard Blackwood." A heavy silence fell over the room. Elaine had gone quite pale, while Mr. Petherick's hand trembled slightly as he refolded the letter. "This is most disturbing," the solicitor said at length. "Richard never expressed such concerns to me during our meetings regarding his will." "Nor to me," Elaine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About his first wife, Caroline. He only ever said it was a tragic accident. A fall down the stairs, I understood." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, now spoke up. "I think perhaps we should consult with Dr. Haydock before opening any more letters. If there is any possibility that Mr. Blackwood's death was not entirely natural, a medical opinion would be valuable." Mr. Petherick nodded in agreement. "A sensible suggestion, Miss Marple. I shall telephone him immediately." Dr. Haydock arrived at Blackwood Manor later that afternoon, his weathered face grave as he listened to their account of the hidden letters and Richard's suspicions. When they had finished, he sighed heavily. "I certified death due to cardiac failure, which, given Richard's medical history, seemed entirely plausible," he explained. "However, I will admit that I was somewhat surprised by the rapidity with which his condition deteriorated in his final hours. There was an intensity to his symptoms that, while not impossible with heart disease, was certainly unusual." "Could it have been hastened somehow?" Elaine asked hesitantly. The doctor frowned. "Several medications or substances could exacerbate an existing heart condition, yes. Without a post-mortem examination, it would be impossible to say for certain." "Is such an examination still possible?" Mr. Petherick inquired. "Given the time elapsed since burial, it would be complicated, but not impossible," Dr. Haydock replied. "However, we would need substantial grounds to request an exhumation." The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, a stout, methodical man known in St. Mary Mead for his thoroughness, if not his tact. He carried a newspaper in an evidence bag. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began without preamble, "your housekeeper found this in the Morning Post. Given your previous report about threatening letters, she thought it best to call us immediately." He displayed the newspaper, that day's edition, with Richard's death notice circled in red ink. Below it, in letters cut from magazines and pasted onto the page, were the chilling words, "You're next." "This is no longer a matter of family disagreement," Inspector Slack stated firmly. "This is now an active police investigation, and in light of these letters suggesting Mr. Blackwood himself had concerns about his safety, I believe we have grounds to request a post-mortem examination." As the inspector began questioning Elaine about who might wish her harm, Miss Marple quietly slipped the envelope addressed to her into her handbag. Whatever message Richard Blackwood had intended for her, she sensed it would be best read in private. Later that evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just one sentence. "Trust no first impressions, especially not your own." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes narrowed in thought. Richard Blackwood, it seemed, had known she would become involved, and had offered her a cryptic warning. But against what, or whom, she had yet to discover. Chapter 3. The Contested Signature. The morning brought a flurry of activity to Blackwood Manor. Inspector Slack had returned with several officers who were now conducting a more thorough investigation of the premises. Miss Marple arrived shortly after breakfast, ostensibly to continue work on the library catalogue, but in reality quite determined to observe the unfolding events. She found Elaine in the morning room, looking pale but composed as she answered Inspector Slack's questions for what appeared to be the second or third time. The inspector's patience was visibly wearing thin. "And you maintain that you had no knowledge of your husband's suspicions regarding his first wife's death?" he asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. "None whatsoever," Elaine replied firmly. "Richard rarely spoke of Caroline. I knew only that she had died in an accident, a fall down the main staircase." Inspector Slack made a non-committal noise. "And these threatening letters began arriving when, precisely?" "The first came 3 days after the funeral," Elaine said. "I thought perhaps it was just someone being cruel. You know how people can be about age differences in marriages." Miss Marple, arranging flowers in a nearby vase and seemingly paying no attention to the conversation, noted the careful neutrality in Elaine's tone. Not for the first time, she wondered at the young widow's remarkable composure under such trying circumstances. The interview was interrupted by the arrival of James Blackwood, accompanied by a thin, scholarly-looking gentleman whom he introduced as Mr. Appleby, a handwriting expert. James's manner was coldly triumphant. "Inspector," he began without preamble, "I am formally contesting my father's will on the grounds that his signature was forged. Mr. Appleby has examined samples of my father's handwriting from different periods and has found significant discrepancies in the signature on the most recent will." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Blackwood?" "Indeed it is," James replied. "One I do not make lightly. Mr. Appleby is prepared to present his findings to the court, but I thought the police should be aware, given the other irregularities surrounding my father's death." Elaine had gone very still. "This is absurd," she said quietly. "Richard signed that will in Mr. Petherick's presence. Are you suggesting that Mr. Petherick, a solicitor of impeccable standing, was party to a forgery?" "I am suggesting," James said, his voice glacial, "that in his final months my father was not always lucid. He may have signed documents without fully understanding their contents, or perhaps his signature was obtained through other means." The implication hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Inspector Slack, sensing the mounting tension, intervened. "Let's remain factual, shall we? Mr. Appleby, I'd like to see your analysis. Mrs. Blackwood, I suggest we contact Mr. Petherick immediately." As the inspector led James and the handwriting expert to a table where they could spread out their documents, Miss Marple approached Elaine, who had sunk into a chair, her face ashen. "I wonder," Miss Marple said conversationally, "if I might see some examples of your husband's handwriting? Various letters or notes, perhaps from different times. It would help me understand his organizational system for the library." Elaine looked up, momentarily confused by this apparent non sequitur, but then comprehension dawned in her eyes. "Yes, of course. He kept correspondence in his desk. I'm sure Inspector Slack wouldn't mind if we looked, since it might help establish the authenticity of his handwriting." In Richard's study, now thoroughly searched by the police, Elaine unlocked a drawer containing several folders of letters and documents. Miss Marple examined them carefully, her faded blue eyes missing nothing as she compared samples from different years. "How curious," she murmured after a while. "What is it?" Elaine asked, leaning closer. "These signatures from last year. See how firm and confident the strokes are? Now compare them to these from just 2 months ago." Miss Marple pointed to later examples where the handwriting appeared shakier, less controlled. "There is indeed a difference, but to my admittedly amateur eye, it suggests physical deterioration rather than forgery." Elaine nodded slowly. Richard's hands would sometimes tremble in his final months. Dr. Haydock said it was related to his heart medication. "I think we should show these to Inspector Slack," Miss Marple suggested, "and perhaps Dr. Haydock could confirm the potential side effects of Mr. Blackwood's medication." They returned to the morning room with their findings, interrupting what had become a rather heated exchange between James and the now arrived Mr. Petherick, who looked deeply offended at the implied suggestion of professional impropriety. "I witnessed Richard Blackwood sign that will with my own eyes," the solicitor was saying, his usual measured tone giving way to indignation. "2 of my clerks also witnessed the signature. The suggestion that any of us would participate in a forgery is outrageous." Inspector Slack accepted the additional handwriting samples from Miss Marple with a grunt that might have been gratitude. As he and Mr. Appleby bent over them, Miss Marple quietly withdrew from the centre of activity, her attention caught by Margaret Blackwood, who stood slightly apart, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. "Such an unpleasant business," Miss Marple remarked, moving to stand beside her. Margaret's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Family disputes often are, Miss Marple, especially when there are millions of pounds at stake. Your father must have had his reasons for changing his will so dramatically," Miss Marple ventured. "Oh, I'm sure he did," Margaret replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "The same reason many aging men make fools of themselves. He was besotted with a younger woman." Miss Marple made a small noise of sympathy. "It must have been difficult, watching your father remarry." "Difficult?" Margaret gave a short, harsh laugh. "It was humiliating. After Mother died, I gave up everything to run this household. 15 years of my life, devoted to Father and this house. Then Elaine appears, and suddenly I'm surplus to requirements." "I understand you were very close to your mother," Miss Marple said gently. A shadow passed over Margaret's face. "I was with her the day she died. Did you know that? I heard her fall. That terrible sound." She broke off, composing herself. "And now to learn that Father suspected it wasn't an accident after all. It's almost too much to bear." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "Have you shared these concerns with the police?" "What concerns?" "That Father, in his paranoid final months, imagined conspiracies where none existed?" "No, Miss Marple, I have not." Margaret's tone had turned defensive. She glanced across the room to where Robert had just entered, looking somewhat dishevelled. "If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with my brother." As Margaret moved away, Miss Marple observed the brief, intense conversation between the siblings. Though she couldn't hear their words, their body language spoke volumes. Margaret urgent and insistent, Robert defensive, then troubled. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by Inspector Slack announcing that he was taking the will and all samples of Richard Blackwood's handwriting into evidence for further expert analysis. James looked satisfied, Mr. Petherick offended, and Elaine simply tired. As the gathering began to disperse, Miss Marple found herself approached by Robert Blackwood, who had broken away from his sister. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said, attempting a charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I understand you're helping Elaine with Father's library. Very kind of you." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I've always found libraries so fascinating. They reveal so much about their owners, don't you think?" "I suppose they do," Robert agreed absently. He hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "Look, I wonder if I might have a word with you. In private. It's about Elaine." Intrigued, Miss Marple allowed him to lead her to a quiet corner of the terrace, well away from the other family members. "I feel I should tell you," Robert began, running a hand through his already tousled hair, "that James and Margaret are quite wrong about Elaine. She's not the gold digger they make her out to be." "Indeed?" Miss Marple prompted when he paused. "The thing is," Robert continued, his voice lowered further, "I've known Elaine longer than they realize. We met several times before Father married her." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose fractionally. "I see." "No, not like that," Robert said quickly. "It wasn't romantic. We met to discuss concerns about the family business. I had discovered some financial irregularities, transfers of funds that couldn't be explained. I suspected James was embezzling." "And you confided this to Elaine?" "Rather than your father directly." Robert looked uncomfortable. Father and I had a strained relationship. He thought I was irresponsible, unable to manage money, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely untrue, but he wouldn't have believed me about James without proof. So Elaine helped you gather evidence? Miss Marple suggested. She tried. As Father's secretary, she had access to certain records, but before we could confirm anything, Father proposed to her. After that, she felt it would be inappropriate to continue our investigation. Robert sighed. I've always wondered if Father changed his will because he discovered something about James on his own. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Craven, who had attended Richard in his final weeks. She had come to collect some personal items left at the house, and was now speaking with Inspector Slack near the entrance hall. Miss Marple, excusing herself from Robert, drifted closer, her keen ears picking up the exchange. Mr. Blackwood was taking additional medication in his final weeks, Nurse Craven was saying. Pills that weren't prescribed by Dr. Haydock. When I asked about them, he said one of his children had provided them to help him sleep. Did he specify which child? Inspector Slack asked sharply. The nurse shook her head. No, just that they were a family remedy of some sort. I was concerned and mentioned it to Dr. Haydock, but Mr. Blackwood was quite insistent. And did these pills appear to help him sleep? Not particularly, the nurse replied. In fact, his condition seemed to worsen after he began taking them, but he was adamant about continuing. Miss Marple, processing this new information, was startled by a sudden commotion from the direction of Richard's study. James's voice, raised in anger, carried clearly through the hall. What do you mean, selling his controlling interest? He couldn't possibly. Miss Marple followed Inspector Slack to the study, where they found James confronting Mr. Petherick, a letter clutched in his hand. Is something the matter? Inspector Slack inquired. James turned, his face flushed with anger. This letter, from Father's business partner in London. Apparently Father had been discussing selling his controlling interest in the company, to a competitor no less. It's preposterous. Mr. Petherick cleared his throat. Richard did mention exploring such options during our last meeting. He seemed concerned about the company's future direction. This is her influence. James spat, gesturing toward Elaine, who had followed them into the room. She poisoned him against his own family, his own legacy. That's not true, Elaine protested. Richard was worried about financial inconsistencies in the company accounts. He never specified what they were, but he was deeply troubled. The accusation hung in the air, creating a palpable tension. Inspector Slack, ever practical, intervened once again. I believe we've all had quite enough excitement for one morning. I'll be taking statements from each of you individually throughout the day. In the meantime, I must ask that no one leaves the area without informing me first. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Elaine toward the library, where they had ostensibly been heading all morning. There was another letter from Richard, Elaine said softly once they were alone. In our bedroom. I found it this morning hidden in a copy of Jane Eyre, the book he gave me when he proposed. She withdrew an envelope from her pocket. It warns me not to trust anyone in the family, and mentions the existence of a second will, hidden where only you would think to look. But I've no idea what that means. Before Miss Marple could respond, a tremendous crash echoed from outside, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a scream. They rushed to the window in time to see Elaine's silver sports car, which had been parked on the sloping driveway, smashed against a stone wall. Hopkins, the elderly gardener, was pointing frantically beneath the vehicle. The brake lines, he was shouting to Inspector Slack, who had reached the scene first. They've been cut clean through. if the missus had been driving down that hill. Miss Marple turned to Elaine, whose face had drained of all colour as the implication became clear. Someone had not only threatened her life, but had now actively attempted to take it. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we must find that second will with all possible haste. Whoever is behind these attempts clearly fears what it might contain." Chapter 4. Family Skeletons. The attempted sabotage of Elaine's car had profound repercussions. Inspector Slack, no longer viewing the matter as merely threatening letters, had insisted that Elaine accept police protection. A young constable now stood sentry at Blackwood Manor, much to the visible irritation of James and Margaret. Miss Marple, having witnessed the discovery of the cut brake lines, had quietly returned to her cottage, her mind working methodically through the puzzle before her. Richard Blackwood's cryptic message to her, "Trust no first impressions, especially not your own," suggested that something or someone in this case was not as they appeared. The following morning she made her way to the vicarage, where she knew the Reverend Leonard Clement's wife, Griselda, to be an inexhaustible source of village gossip. Griselda welcomed her with tea and fresh-baked scones, eager to hear the latest developments. "Is it true that someone tried to kill Mrs. Blackwood?" Griselda asked, her eyes wide with the delicious horror of genuine scandal in their quiet village. "There was an incident with her car," Miss Marple replied cautiously. "The police are investigating." How extraordinary. First Richard Blackwood changes his will to cut out his children, then he dies suddenly, and now someone's trying to harm his widow. Griselda shook her head. "It all seems so theatrical." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "I wonder, Griselda, what do you recall about the death of Richard's first wife?" "Caroline, I believe her name was." Griselda's brow furrowed in concentration. "That was before we came to St. Mary Mead, but I've heard people talk about it. A terrible accident. She fell down the main staircase at Blackwood Manor. Broke her neck, I believe." "Did people speak of it as unusual in any way?" "Well," Griselda lowered her voice, though they were quite alone, "Mrs. Price Ridley once hinted that there was something odd about the timing. Apparently Richard Blackwood had taken out a rather substantial life insurance policy on Caroline not long before her death. The payout apparently saved him from some financial difficulty." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Financial difficulty?" Richard Blackwood was one of the wealthiest men in the county. "Not always, from what I gather," Griselda replied. "There was some trouble with the business around that time. Patents that went missing, I think. But then, after Caroline's death, Richard somehow recovered them. Quite the turnaround, they say." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. "The Blackwood children must have been quite young when they lost their mother." "James would have been in his late 20s, I suppose. Margaret in her mid-20s. And Robert just a university student." Griselda poured more tea. "It must have been dreadful for them." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "The loss of a parent is always difficult, especially in such circumstances." After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple paid a visit to Colonel Bantry, who had known Richard Blackwood for many years through various county committees and business associations. She found him in his garden, pruning roses with military precision. "Blackwood?" the colonel repeated when she inquired. "Shrewd businessman, very shrewd. Not always the most scrupulous, if you take my meaning." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked innocently. Colonel Bantry harumphed. "There was that business with the patents. Technical specifications for some new manufacturing process. The story was that they'd gone missing, nearly bankrupting the company. Then, after Caroline's unfortunate accident, Richard suddenly found them again. Very convenient timing." Do you think there might have been some impropriety? Hard to say, the Colonel admitted. The rival company that had miraculously developed the same technology suddenly withdrew their product. Rumor had it that Richard had something on their chief engineer. Blackmail, perhaps. But it was all hushed up. And the family business after that? Flourished. Absolutely flourished. James took a more active role. He's got a head for figures, that one. Cold as ice, mind you, but effective. Colonel Bantry snipped a withered rose with particular vigor. Always seems to be tension between him and his father, though. Professional rivalry, perhaps. Miss Marple thanked the Colonel for his insights and made her way to the village shop. There, while ostensibly selecting knitting wool, she engaged Mrs. Blade, the owner, in conversation about old photographs of village events. I don't suppose you have any pictures from the Blackwood Garden party? The one held about 5 years ago for the hospital fund? Mrs. Blade did indeed have such photographs, and soon she and Miss Marple were poring over them. One showed the Blackwood family arranged formally on the terrace, Richard standing tall and imposing, James slightly apart, his expression reserved, Margaret seated rigidly beside her father, and Robert slouched casually against a pillar, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. They never did look a happy family, did they? Mrs. Blade observed. Not since Mrs. Blackwood, the first Mrs. Blackwood, I mean, passed away. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. No, they don't appear particularly content. Her next stop was the Blackwood factory, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the village. Presenting herself at reception, she asked to see Robert Blackwood, having ascertained from village gossip that he maintained a nominal position in the company's public relations department. Robert received her in a modestly appointed office that showed little evidence of regular use. He seemed surprised by her visit, but welcomed her cordially enough. Miss Marple, this is unexpected. How can I help you? I was hoping you might clarify something for me, she said, settling into the visitor's chair. You mentioned meeting with Elaine before your father's marriage to discuss potential financial irregularities in the company. I wonder if you might elaborate on that. Robert's expression grew guarded. I'm not sure this is the appropriate place. I understand your reluctance, Miss Marple interrupted gently, but given recent events, the threats to Elaine, the tampering with her car, I believe it's important to understand all the underlying tensions in your family. Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. Very well. About 2 years ago, I noticed discrepancies in some of the company's financial reports. Large sums being transferred to offshore accounts, then returned as investment income. It seemed suspicious. And you believed James was responsible? Who else? He oversees all the financial operations. Father trusted him implicitly with that side of the business. Robert's mouth twisted bitterly. James has always been the responsible one, while I'm the family disappointment. So you approached Elaine, who was then your father's secretary? Robert nodded. She had access to documents I couldn't get to. She agreed to help me investigate. But then father proposed to her, and everything changed. She said it would be inappropriate to continue, given her new relationship with father. Did you ever find proof of James's involvement? No, but the suspicious transfers stopped around the time Elaine became engaged to father. I always wondered if James realized we were onto him. Miss Marple considered this thoughtfully. And your father never knew about your suspicions? I tried to tell him once, but he dismissed it out of hand. Said I was trying to undermine James out of jealousy. Robert's expression darkened. Father and I never did see eye to eye. Thanking Robert for his candor, Miss Marple departed, Her next destination, the small cottage on the edge of the village where Mr. Petherick's clerk lived. Under the pretext of discussing a minor matter related to her own will, she gently steered the conversation toward the preparation of Richard Blackwood's final testament. Most unusual circumstances, the clerk admitted, after ascertaining that the matter was now part of a police investigation. Mr. Blackwood insisted on absolute privacy. Brought the text already prepared. He did. Mr. Petherick just had to formalize it legally. And the signing? Was that all in order? Oh, yes. Quite proper. Mr. Blackwood signed in the presence of myself and another clerk as witnesses. His hand was a bit shaky, but he was quite emphatic about the contents. This aligned with Miss Marple's own observations about Richard's declining physical health. As she made her way back toward the village, she decided on an impromptu visit to a small house on the far side of St. Mary Mead, the residence of Miss Hartnell, Caroline Blackwood's elder sister. Miss Hartnell was a thin, angular woman, with piercing eyes that had lost none of their sharpness, despite her advanced age. She received Miss Marple with cautious politeness. "I rarely speak of Caroline's death," she said, when Miss Marple broached the subject. "It was a dark time." "I understand," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "But there are concerns now that there might have been more to her accident than was apparent at the time." Miss Hartnell's mouth tightened. "I always had my doubts. Caroline was not a careless woman. She would never have fallen down those stairs by accident, and there was something troubling her in the weeks before her death." "Troubling her?" "She wrote to me." Miss Hartnell rose and removed a small wooden box from a desk drawer. From it she extracted several yellowed envelopes. She had discovered something about the Blackwood business. Financial irregularities, she called them. She was going to confront Richard. Miss Marple accepted the letters Miss Hartnell offered her. In them, Caroline detailed her growing suspicion that Richard was engaged in some form of industrial espionage or fraud, though she was vague about the specifics. "The last letter came just 3 days before she died," Miss Hartnell said quietly. "She wrote that she had found proof and would no longer remain silent." "Did you share these with the police at the time?" Miss Hartnell shook her head. "Caroline's death was ruled an accident. Richard was devastated, or appeared to be. I had no concrete evidence, only my sister's suspicions. And there were the children to consider." "The children?" Miss Marple murmured. "How did they respond to their mother's death?" "James was stoic, as always. Margaret was distraught. She and Caroline were very close. And Robert—" Miss Hartnell paused. "Robert was away at university. By the time he returned, it was all over." As Miss Marple left Miss Hartnell's cottage, her mind was working feverishly to connect the various threads of information she had gathered. The picture emerging was complex and troubling, a family built on secrets, resentments, and possibly murder. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Inspector Slack's car parked outside Blackwood Manor. Quickening her pace, she arrived to find a scene of barely contained chaos. Inspector Slack was questioning James Blackwood in the entrance hall, his tone decidedly accusatory. "You claim you were at your club in London yesterday afternoon, yet we have a witness who saw you near the garage shortly before Mrs. Blackwood's car was tampered with," Slack was saying. James's face was flushed with anger. "Your witness is mistaken. I was in London from noon until late evening. Dozens of people can confirm my whereabouts. And yet your credit card shows no charges in London yesterday," Slack countered. "No train ticket, no lunch at your club, nothing." "I used cash," James snapped. "Is that a crime now?" Margaret, hovering nearby, interrupted. "This is absurd, Inspector. My brother is not a saboteur or a murderer." Where is Mrs. Blackwood now? Miss Marple inquired quietly of the uniformed constable standing by the door. Upstairs, ma'am, with the police doctor. She collapsed about an hour ago. Exhaustion, they think. Concerned, Miss Marple made her way up to Elaine's bedroom, where she found the young widow pale and drawn, but conscious. Dr. Haydock at her bedside. Miss Marple, Elaine said weakly, I'm afraid I'm not being a very good hostess today. Never mind that, Miss Marple replied kindly. You must rest. Dr. Haydock drew Miss Marple aside. I've given her a mild sedative. The stress of the situation is taking its toll. That, combined with her condition. Her condition, Miss Marple repeated. The doctor looked surprised. I assumed she had told you. Mrs. Blackwood is expecting a child, about 3 months along now. Miss Marple concealed her astonishment. This new information changed everything. An heir to the Blackwood fortune, one who would supersede the claims of Richard's adult children, regardless of which will prevail. As she descended the stairs, deep in thought, she nearly collided with Inspector Slack, who was now examining James's alibi more thoroughly. I don't suppose, Miss Marple ventured, that you've had the results of the toxicology tests on Mr. Blackwood's medication? Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. As a matter of fact, we have. There were traces of a compound that would have exacerbated his heart condition over time. Not enough to kill him outright, but sufficient to accelerate his decline considerably. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Miss Marple's mind. She was about to respond when a commotion from the direction of the library drew their attention. Margaret's voice, shrill with distress, called out, Someone help! It's Robert. I think he's dying. They rushed to the library to find Robert Blackwood collapsed on the floor, his breathing shallow, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside him. Dr. Haydock, summoned from upstairs, quickly examined him. He's been poisoned, the doctor declared grimly. The same substance found in Richard's medication, if I'm not mistaken, but in a much higher dose. We need to get him to a hospital immediately. As Robert was rushed away in an ambulance, Miss Marple surveyed the scene. The whiskey decanter on the library sideboard, she noted, was Robert's preferred drink, a fact known to everyone in the household. Inspector Slack, his face grim, turned to James and Margaret. I believe I have sufficient grounds to make an arrest. James Blackwood, I am arresting you on suspicion of the attempted murder of your brother, Robert Blackwood, and of attempting to cause grievous bodily harm to Elaine Blackwood by tampering with her vehicle. As James protested his innocence, and Margaret looked on in horror, Miss Marple remained silent, her pale blue eyes observing every reaction. Something was not quite right with the inspector's conclusion, but she needed one final piece of evidence to complete the picture, evidence she believed might be found in that elusive second will. Chapter 5. The Secret Will. The poisoning of Robert Blackwood cast a pall over the household. While the young man fought for his life in hospital, James Blackwood found himself released on bail after Mr. Petherick provided a compelling character reference and arranged for a substantial surety. Miss Marple, watching these developments from a discreet distance, had not been idle. Richard Blackwood's cryptic message to her, along with Elaine's mention of a second will hidden where only you would think to look, had set her mind working on the puzzle with characteristic, methodical precision. The day after James's release, she paid a visit to Elaine, who remained under police protection at Blackwood Manor. She found the young widow in the conservatory, pale but composed, arranging flowers with careful attention. Miss Marple, Elaine greeted her with a wan smile. I'm glad you've come. The house feels like a prison with police at every entrance, and the family situation is hardly comfortable. I can imagine, Miss Marple replied sympathetically. Margaret remains here, I understand? Yes, Elaine sighed. She barely speaks to me, but she refuses to leave. She insists on staying for Robert's sake, while he's in hospital. And how is Robert progressing? Improving, thank goodness. The doctors believe he'll make a full recovery, though it may take time. Elaine's hands trembled slightly as she positioned a stem of freesia in the arrangement. I still can't believe James would try to poison his own brother. Miss Marple observed her carefully. The evidence does seem compelling, but I wonder if we might be missing something important. What do you mean? I've been thinking about Richard's letter to you, about the second will, hidden somewhere only you would think to look. Miss Marple paused. It occurs to me that the most obvious place would be among his personal effects. Items of sentimental value, perhaps. Elaine looked thoughtful. There's his watch collection in the safe, his favorite books in the study, the jade figurines he collected on his travels. She trailed off, then suddenly brightened. Wait, there's also our memory box. Richard kept mementos from our courtship and early marriage. It's quite private, which is why I hadn't thought to search it before now. The memory box proved to be an elegant lacquered chest hidden at the back of Elaine's wardrobe. Inside were theatre tickets, dried flowers, handwritten notes, and photographs. The tender accumulation of a relationship surprisingly romantic, despite the age difference between husband and wife. Nestled among these keepsakes was a sealed envelope marked simply, "For Elaine, when needed." With trembling fingers, Elaine broke the seal and withdrew several sheets of paper written in Richard's increasingly unsteady hand, along with a small key. "It's a letter," she said, scanning the pages, explaining his suspicions and fears, and instructions to retrieve something from a safe deposit box at his London bank. She looked up, her eyes wide. Miss Marple. He believed someone was trying to kill him, and he names names. Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by Inspector Slack, who had come to inform Elaine that the toxicology reports had confirmed the presence of the same poison in both Richard's medication and the whiskey that had nearly killed Robert. "And there's more," the inspector added grimly. "We've found traces of the substance in James Blackwood's desk drawer at the company offices. The case against him is building." "Inspector," Miss Marple interjected, "I believe you should see this." She indicated the letter Elaine had just discovered. "It may provide additional context to your investigation." Inspector Slack read the document with increasing interest. "This is significant," he admitted. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'll need to take this as evidence, and we should retrieve whatever is in that safe deposit box immediately." Arrangements were made for Elaine to travel to London the following day, accompanied by both Inspector Slack and Miss Marple. As they departed from Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple noticed Margaret watching them from an upper window, her expression unreadable. The journey to London was completed in relative silence, each passenger absorbed in their own thoughts. At the bank, Elaine presented the key and her identification, and they were escorted to a private room where the safe deposit box was brought to them. Inside was a slim leather portfolio containing several documents. Handwritten notes by Richard detailing his suspicions, financial records showing irregularities in the company accounts, and most significantly, a sealed legal envelope bearing Mr. Petherick's firm's name and the words, "Last Will and Testament of Richard Edward Blackwood." The date marked on it was just 1 week before Richard's death. "Shall we?" Inspector Slack asked, looking at the sealed will. "I believe we should have Mr. Petherick present for the opening," Miss Marple suggested. "Given the legal implications, it would be most proper." Upon their return to St. Mary Mead, Mr. Petherick was summoned to Blackwood Manor. The elderly solicitor arrived promptly, his curiosity evident beneath his professional demeanour. In the formal setting of Richard's study, with Inspector Slack, Ghislaine, Miss Marple, and, at her own insistence, Margaret in attendance, Mr. Petherick carefully broke the seal on the envelope. "This appears to be in order," he said, after examining the document. "Properly signed and witnessed. It is indeed Richard Blackwood's final will and testament, superseding all previous versions." "And the provisions?" Elaine asked quietly. Mr. Petherick adjusted his spectacles. "Quite different from the will currently being contested. This one establishes a trust comprising the majority of Richard's assets. The trust is to be administered by Elaine as the primary trustee, with specific instructions regarding charitable distributions and, this is most unusual, restitution payments to several companies and individuals." "Restitution payments?" Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "Yes," Mr. Petherick confirmed. "According to the accompanying letter of instruction, Richard wished to make amends for certain improprieties in his business dealings over the years. The individuals and companies listed were apparently harmed in some way by Richard's actions." Margaret made a small, distressed sound. "Father was admitting to fraud? Publicly? It would destroy the family name, the company, everything." "The provisions are carefully structured to minimize public scandal while ensuring proper compensation," Mr. Petherick clarified. "However, yes, there would be significant financial consequences, particularly for the company." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "This gives James Blackwood an even stronger motive for wanting his father silenced before this will could be executed." "And who inherits the remainder of the estate?" Miss Marple inquired. "Elaine receives the house and a modest income," Mr. Petherick read. "The children each receive similar provisions, and there's a substantial sum set aside for any future children born to Elaine within 1 year of Richard's death." All eyes turned to Elaine, who placed a protective hand over her abdomen. "Richard knew," she said softly. "I told him just days before he died." Margaret's face had gone white. "You're carrying my father's child? A new heir?" "Yes," Elaine confirmed. "I'm about 3 months along." The implications hung heavy in the air. A new Blackwood heir would further complicate the already contentious inheritance situation, potentially displacing the 3 adult children, regardless of which will ultimately prevail. As they digested this revelation, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to an additional document that had fallen from the portfolio, a personal letter from Richard to Elaine, separate from the legal instructions. She handed it to the young widow, who read it with increasing emotion. "He knew," Elaine whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "He knew someone was trying to harm him. He suspected James had discovered something about his past business dealings, something so damaging that he would go to any lengths to prevent it becoming public." "What past dealings?" Inspector Slack pressed. Elaine looked up, her expression troubled. "Richard doesn't specify exactly. He mentions only that the truth about Caroline's death was somehow connected." "Caroline?" "The first Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple clarified, though she had already begun to connect certain threads in her mind. "Yes," Margaret interjected sharply. "My mother. She died 15 years ago. An accident on the main staircase. At least, it was ruled an accident." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes met Margaret's dark ones. "And you have doubted that ruling all these years, haven't you, Miss Blackwood?" "I was there that day," Margaret said, her voice suddenly hollow. "I heard them arguing before it happened." Mother had discovered something about father's business, some betrayal or fraud. She threatened to expose him. The pieces were falling into place for Miss Marple now. And then she fell, she said gently, or was pushed. I never saw the actual incident, Margaret admitted. I only heard the argument, then the terrible sound of her falling. Father called for help, claimed she had tripped. Everyone believed him. He was Richard Blackwood, after all. Respected, trusted. But you suspected the truth, Miss Marple pressed. I could never prove anything, Margaret replied, years of suppressed anger finally surfacing. And then life simply continued. Father buried himself in work. James took on more responsibility at the company. Robert was away at university, and she gestured vaguely. I remained at home, keeper of a terrible suspicion I could neither confirm nor dismiss. Until recently, Miss Marple suggested. Something changed, didn't it? Elaine, Margaret said simply. When father married her, he began to change. He spoke sometimes of regrets, of making amends. I feared he might actually confess the truth about mother. Inspector Slack, who had been following this exchange with growing interest, interjected. Miss Blackwood, are you suggesting that your father was responsible for your mother's death, and that this knowledge might have motivated your brother James to take action? I'm not suggesting anything, Margaret replied stiffly. I am merely relating facts as I recall them. The atmosphere in the study had grown increasingly tense. Mr. Petherick cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should adjourn for the day. There is much to process, and legal matters to be set in motion regarding this newly discovered will. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple noticed a curious exchange of glances between Margaret and Elaine. Not hostile, as might be expected given their relationship, but something more complex, almost like recognition, or perhaps a shared understanding. Inspector Slack departed with the documents as evidence, promising to continue his investigation with this new information in mind. Mr. Petherick left to begin the necessary legal proceedings. Margaret retreated to her room without another word. Left alone with Elaine, Miss Marple accepted the offer of tea in the conservatory once again. As they sat surrounded by Richard Blackwood's prized orchids, Miss Marple finally voiced the question that had been forming in her mind. My dear, she said gently, I wonder if you might tell me how you and Richard first met. The true story, if you don't mind. Elaine looked startled, then resigned. You've guessed, haven't you? I didn't apply for the secretarial position by chance. I sought out Richard Blackwood deliberately. Because? Miss Marple prompted. Because 15 years ago my father's company was ruined by industrial espionage, patents stolen, processes replicated by a competitor. That competitor was Richard Blackwood. Elaine's voice had grown cold. My father never recovered. He took his own life a year later. So you came seeking what? Revenge? Justice? Evidence, Elaine replied. I wanted proof of what Richard had done, proof that would stand up in court. I changed my name, created a new identity, and worked my way into his confidence. But something changed, Miss Marple observed. Elaine's expression softened slightly. Richard wasn't the monster I had imagined. He was complex, flawed, and genuinely remorseful for his past actions, though he never specifically mentioned my father. When he proposed, I accepted partly to gain deeper access to his personal records, but also because I had begun to see him as a human being. And now? Miss Marple asked. With these revelations about his first wife's death. Elaine placed her hand protectively over her abdomen once more. Now I don't know what to believe, but I know I want justice. For my father, for Caroline, for Richard himself, if he was indeed murdered. And I want my child to inherit a legacy cleansed of its darkest secrets. As Miss Marple left Blackwood Manor that evening, she pondered the intricate web of deception, revenge, and possibly redemption she had uncovered. Richard Blackwood's cryptic warning made more sense now. Trust no first impressions. Indeed, no one in this complex drama was quite what they had initially appeared to be. And yet, the central question remained unanswered. Who had poisoned Richard Blackwood, and later attempted to poison Robert? The evidence pointed to James, but Miss Marple's instincts told her there might be yet another layer to this mystery, one final secret still waiting to be revealed. Chapter 6. Justice from the Grave. 3 days after Robert's poisoning, Miss Marple arranged a gathering at Blackwood Manor. The drawing-room had an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension as the participants assembled. Inspector Slack, looking official and somewhat impatient. Mr. Petherick, dignified yet troubled. Elaine, pale but composed. James, recently released on bail, his face set in defiant lines. And Margaret, thin and anxious, her eyes darting between the other attendees. Robert, still recovering in hospital, was the only absent family member. His condition had stabilized, but the doctors had advised against his discharge for at least another week. "I've asked you all here," Miss Marple began in her gentle, slightly apologetic manner, "because I believe we now have all the pieces necessary to understand what has truly been happening in the Blackwood family. I fail to see what a village spinster can contribute that police investigation has not already uncovered," James said coldly. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Blackwood, I suggest you listen to Miss Marple. Her insights have proven valuable in previous cases." Miss Marple smiled briefly at the inspector before continuing. "The safe deposit box mentioned in Richard's note to Elaine has been located and opened. It contained not a will, as we expected, but something perhaps more revealing, a detailed account of Richard's suspicions and evidence he had gathered." Mr. Petherick cleared his throat. "I have examined the documents, and they are indeed most disturbing. Richard had been conducting his own private investigation for several years." "Investigation into what?" Margaret demanded. "Into the death of your mother, Caroline," Miss Marple replied softly, "and into certain business practices at Blackwood Industries." The room fell silent. Miss Marple turned to James, her pale blue eyes suddenly sharp and penetrating. "15 years ago, your mother discovered evidence of your father's fraudulent business practices, specifically that he had stolen patents from a competitor. Before she could expose him, Richard arranged her accident. You knew the truth, didn't you, James? You discovered it somehow, but lacked proof." James's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "I suspected," he admitted after a moment. "Mother had confided some of her concerns to me before her death. Afterward, the business made a miraculous recovery. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots." "So you worked alongside your father all these years, knowing he was responsible for your mother's death?" Elaine asked, her voice tinged with horror. "I had no proof," James replied tightly. "And there was the business to consider. Family legacy, employees who depended on us. I compartmentalized." "But you never forgave him," Miss Marple observed. "No," James acknowledged, his voice barely audible. "I never did." Miss Marple nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Richard, in his final years, experienced genuine remorse. His relationship with Elaine sparked a desire to make amends. His changed will wasn't just about providing for his new wife. but about making restitution. The bulk of the estate was to be held in trust, with Elaine as trustee, to compensate the families harmed by his earlier business practices. Mr. Petherick nodded. That is correct. Richard confessed certain improprieties to me when preparing his will. His plan for restitution satisfied my ethical concerns about the source of his wealth. When James discovered his father's intentions, perhaps by accessing his correspondence or overhearing conversations, he realized both financial ruin and exposure of family secrets were imminent. Miss Marple continued. He began slowly poisoning Richard using medication that mimicked natural heart failure progression. This is absurd, James protested. You have no proof of any such thing. On the contrary, Inspector Slack interjected. The toxicology report confirmed the presence of the compound in both Richard's medication and the whiskey that poisoned Robert. Furthermore, we found traces of the same substance in your desk drawer at the company offices. And Robert? Elaine asked softly. Why poison him? Because Robert had independently discovered the truth about Caroline's death, Miss Marple explained. Not from James, but from Richard himself. In his remorse, Richard had confided in his youngest son, perhaps seeking some form of absolution. Robert confronted James about it, threatening exposure. It was meant to look like suicide, Inspector Slack added grimly. A tragic end to the troubled youngest Blackwood, despondent over family discord. Margaret, who had been silent throughout these revelations, suddenly spoke. I knew, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew James was poisoning Father. I suspected, at least. The pills? They were James's idea. A natural remedy to help Father sleep. She looked up, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I remained silent out of family loyalty, and then when Robert was poisoned, I couldn't bear it any more. It was Margaret who called us anonymously about Robert's poisoning, Inspector Slack confirmed, and who provided the decisive evidence about James's involvement. James turned to his sister, his expression one of cold betrayal. After everything I've done to protect this family's legacy? You became what you hated, Margaret replied simply. You became Father. Inspector Slack stepped forward. James Blackwood, I am arresting you for the murder of Richard Blackwood and the attempted murder of Robert Blackwood. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. As Slack led James away, Elaine turned to Miss Marple. How did you know? About the trust, about Richard's remorse. It was the only explanation that made sense of all the facts, Miss Marple replied. Richard's cryptic warning to me, trust no first impressions, suggested he wasn't the villainous character he appeared to be, at least not at the end. And the fact that he left his fortune in trust, rather than to you outright, indicated a purpose beyond mere provision for a beloved wife. Mr. Petherick nodded. Richard's true wishes will now be honoured. Elaine will oversee the restitution trust, and Robert, once recovered, will manage the legitimate aspects of the business. The victims of Richard's earlier fraud will receive compensation. And the child, Elaine said softly, her hand resting protectively on her abdomen, will inherit a legacy cleansed of its darkest secrets. Later, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she reflected on the case. Justice had worked through unexpected channels. Richard, a guilty man, had in his final acts sought redemption, setting in motion the events that would ultimately expose not only his own crimes, but also those committed in response to them. The inheritance that truly mattered was not money, but truth, a bequest that, though painful, had finally freed the living from the shadows of the past. As she settled into her armchair with her knitting, Miss Marple thought how often in her experience the dead reached out to influence the living, for good or ill. In this case, Richard Blackwood had achieved from beyond the grave what he had failed to accomplish in life, a kind of justice, imperfect perhaps, but justice none the less. The gentle clicking of her knitting needles filled the quiet cottage as darkness fell over St. Mary Mead. The case of the widow's inheritance now closed, its secrets laid finally to rest.